All right, this is part 11, the Synagogue of Satan, Footprints in History. I'll continue with the further decline and breakup of the Roman Empire. There were different emperors in the eastern and western halves so that the empire could be more easily ruled, and they struggled against each other for power. The last emperor that had ruled the empire by himself was Theodosius. By this time, the title of emperor was looked down upon, and it was not taken by powerful men. The emperors had mostly become just puppets of others. Eastern rulers would often deflect invaders and other enemies to the west, where they wouldn't be a problem for the Eastern Empire. Alaric the Bold had been at the Battle of Frigidus fighting for Emperor Theodosius, but he broke with the Eastern Roman Empire and led his people, the Visigoths, into Italy, and they were checked there for several years until they finally entered the city of Rome in 410 AD. Unlike what's portrayed in some history books, the Goths spared much of Rome and didn't destroy most of the buildings and the churches, and they even spared Christians. There are some accounts that claim that the Goths took the temple treasures of Jerusalem, which had been brought to Rome by Titus several centuries before. The Goths headed south in Italy. They were trying to go to North Africa until the sudden death of Alaric the same year. So they turned north, and they finally ended up in southern Gaul, and it's said that they kept the temple treasures from Jerusalem with them there for several years. Roman rulers had a problem with the Visigoths because they were Arian Christians, and this would be a problem for either Trinitarian Christians or pagans also. And there were other important tribes that were coming into the Roman Empire that were also Arian Christians. That would be the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Ostrogoths, and the Lombards. The Romans had actually hired the Huns to attack the Burgundians, but the Huns got out of control and began to attack the Eastern Empire because it was much more populated and they could get much more money out of it. The Visigoths weren't very sophisticated in church doctrine, as I mentioned before, and many Germanic tribes like them that held to the Arian form of Christianity didn't hold to it because they really understood the doctrine fully, but because it gave them a national identity. And if you remember, this was a problem for the Stoic upper classes of Rome because they believed in no national borders and no national identity except their own. Arian Christians and Roman Catholics were not even allowed legally to marry. About this time, there was more division in the church. There were several factions that had different beliefs about the nature of Christ, whether he was divine or human or both, like the Monophysites and the Nestorians. The Nestorians were finally condemned as heretics in the Council of Ephesus and also the Council of Chalcedon, and they moved east into Persia, also with the Nazarenes who had similar beliefs, and the Nazarenes were connected to the Desposini. And there was also another group that went as far as Spain and Gaul under the teacher Priscillian of Avila, and they had similar beliefs to the Nestorians and also Gnostic beliefs. They eventually extended into Britain, and they had a lot of influence on the Celtic Church. About this same time, there was an important monastery founded at Marseille in southern Gaul, or France. It was a Cenobite type, not a hermit type, founded by John Cassian, who was a follower of Pachomius of Egypt. And there were other monasteries that followed in southern Gaul and also up the Rhone Valley in Gaul. And it seems that wherever the monasteries were, Jewish traders also followed. The Roman aristocracy were masters of divide and conquer tactics, and they certainly wanted the Huns and Visigoths to destroy each other, but the Visigoths actually turned back the Huns at the Battle of Chalon in Gaul in 451 AD. And you might ask where the Franks were. They were in Gaul also, but they were nowhere to be seen in the battle. When the Huns were turned back by the Visigoths and the Roman army, they went down into Italy, but strangely they didn't cause very much destruction, except for they did destroy the city of Aquileia, a port on the Adriatic coast near where Venice would be later. You might wonder if this was a random act of destruction or if there was some other hidden purpose. The city of Aquileia could be used by the Eastern Roman emperors as their only major port in northern Italy and the Adriatic, and you might think that the Roman aristocracy would have wanted to destroy Aquileia and build their own port in the same area. The standard story is that many in the Roman oligarchy scattered and fled the Huns when they rampaged through Italy, and they fled to the lagoons where Venice would be. And if you remember, many in the Roman aristocracy by now were actually Syro-Phoenician or Babylonian, and they may have been planning all along to build a new port in Venice so that they could take over the sea power of Constantinople. The Roman papacy became much more prominent and gained a lot of prestige at this time. There are reports that the papacy sent Leo the Great to a council where he actually met with the leader of the Huns, Attila, and Leo convinced Attila not to take over the city of Rome and to destroy Italy. And it's not certain whether Leo used money or some other means for this, but you might wonder if Leo was not actually paying Attila to stop, but was rather paying him for a job well done. From then on, Pope Leo and the papacy gained more and more control over the Eastern churches and the Eastern Roman Empire itself. By this time, Vandal pirates were controlling sea trade in the Western Mediterranean, but the Vandals were basically a Germanic land people and didn't have much association with the sea, so you might wonder who was helping them at sea. What's interesting is that at about this time, Clovis, the leader of the Franks, was baptized a Roman Catholic, and I'd said before that the leaders of the Franks had schemed with some of the senatorial families of Rome to make paganism the official religion of the Roman Empire, and some of those same senatorial families actually began to produce popes not long after that. Clovis himself was a Merovingian. The Merovingians were said to be descended from their ancestor Merovec or Merove, and that name has the meaning seaman, which is a bit odd because the Franks as Germanic tribes were not very much associated with the sea. So that's a clue that at least the leaders of the Franks, the Merovingians, had blood ties with sea trading people rather than the Germanic tribes. And there are also accounts that they had blood ties with ruling families of the East, even the House of David of Israel. And there is also some evidence that the Merovingians married into the Franks because some of the Franks were actually descended from the tribe of Benjamin, and this may have come by way of the Spartans. And it's interesting that the names Spartan and also Frank actually mean the same thing. They both mean javelin or spear. And there is some documented proof that the Hasmonean dynasty or the Maccabees did have relations with the Spartans. Ruling families with blood connections like these became known as Rex Deus, which just means priest kings, and they were believed to have records that they were descended from the House of David and the Hasmonean dynasty and also the priests of the Temple at Jerusalem, and they would intermarry with the Nazarenes or the Desposini, but they also probably had connections by blood to the Caesars, and this would mean Nimrod and other ancient Eastern families. The Roman Empire disintegrated as the Eastern rulers would no longer recognize Western emperors, and when they sent an emperor that they did support to the West, he was actually rejected by the Roman army in Italy, and they actually chose the bodyguard of that emperor that was sent by the East. This was Odovacar the Herulian, who was from the Germanic tribes, and he was chosen by the Roman army as king of Italy. And there is a detail that you don't hear much in the history books, which will show you exactly how much influence the hermits actually had. When Odovacar was made king of Italy, he got the personal blessing of Severinus, who was a hermit that had come all the way from the deserts of Egypt. He was known as the Apostle of Noricum, which is now Austria. He had helped the poor and destitute in that area, many refugees from the Germanic tribes, and he was known for being very charitable and helpful in that region. But you wonder if he had actually had ulterior motives. He might have been trying to build up a political support among the Germanic tribes, and so he was known to Odovacar. And this just shows you how much influence the hermits actually had. We think of the hermits as these simple ascetic monks, but to be associated with the new king of Italy, it just makes you wonder. But the Eastern Roman Empire actually had a resurgence when they overtook a lot of the Western Empire again under the Emperor Justinian I. The Ostrogoths had taken over Italy from Odovacar in 493 AD, and they had made the mistake of making political alliances with the Franks and also through intermarriage. The Eastern emperors had already made allegiances with the Franks, and Emperor Justinian I then invaded Italy, and there was a devastating war in Italy which finally ended the rule of the Ostrogoths, but Italy was very much ruined, and it also cost the Eastern emperors a lot of money, and they were greatly weakened by the wars. and this also allowed the Lombards to then come and take over Italy, and it also allowed the Persians or Parthians to take more Roman lands in the east. The Eastern emperors still controlled much of the old Western Empire, but there were continuing struggles with the Parthians to the east, and there were also struggles for the throne of the Eastern Empire. There were many emperors that were not actually even Roman. Then there were some very important events which are glossed over by most history books. The Eastern Emperor Phocas was known to have a very brutal reign from 602 to 610 AD. He had murdered the previous Emperor Maurice, and for this he was actually excommunicated by the Bishop of Constantinople. And in retaliation, Phocas formally recognized the Papacy and the Roman Catholic Church as the supreme church of Christianity. Gregory the Great was also pope for a part of this time. He's usually represented very favorably by the Roman Catholic Church, but if you look closely, there are some curious details which are often overlooked by most histories. He was from a very powerful senatorial family of Rome, which by now should be a red flag, and his family also owned large estates in Sicily, where there were several communities of very powerful Jews. He upheld the church's ban on usury, but he allowed the Jews to lend money, and he also preached toleration of the Jews. So it seems like he just created a loophole for usury. And then he had the papacy borrow large amounts of money from the Jews. Gregory ordered missions to Britain, supposedly to convert the Anglo-Saxons, but it appears that he was just using them against the Celtic church that he wanted to subdue, because so far they were out of his authority. In formally recognizing the papacy and Pope Boniface IV, the Eastern Emperor Phocas bequeathed the Pantheon in Rome to the Roman Catholic Church. The Pantheon was made into a basilica, and it appears that the god Jupiter was disguised as St. Peter, and the goddess Venus was disguised as the Virgin Mary. The important churches of the East, like Antioch, Alexandria, Damascus, Jerusalem, Constantinople, they considered themselves equals or superior to the Roman Catholic Church. The papacy certainly knew that the Eastern Empire and the Parthians both had very much weakened themselves in wars against each other, and also that they had hired Arab mercenaries in the fighting. And it appears that the papacy then schemed to use the Arabs to further take over the Eastern Empire and also to subdue the Eastern churches in its goal to be the supreme church. The papacy again and again would call councils, and they would appear to be trying to unify the Christian church, but it seems that they were really trying to find out the divisions so that they could control it. And it seems that they then took teachings of the Mandeans, Sabaeans, Ebionites, and others to create the religion of Islam, which they would then also use to subdue the Christian churches of the East. In the next part, I'll continue with the rise of Islam and the further rise of the papacy, and also with the rise of Venice. So until next time,